Let's see, what do I got here? How about this one from The Economist? How the Pentagon assesses Ukraine's progress. They were talking to an analyst from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, and I don't know if either one of you had a chance to read this article, but it's astounding because in the beginning of the article, they admit that they completely got Afghanistan wrong. They completely got Iraq wrong. They completely underestimated Russian defenses going into the latest Ukrainian offensive. But at this point, they're very happy that there's been this supposed breakthrough, and now they're very optimistic that they will make a full breakthrough by the end of this year. Daddy, did you get to read this article yet?
I have not, but I'm not surprised by this assessment. Especially what's so interesting about this is as there was news that there was some breakthrough in the Zaporizhzhia region. I know you, Brian, covered the fact that you had the British Challenger 2 burning in the same region, and at the same time you had Sergei Shoigu release data on the latest counteroffensive numbers, which point to a huge contradiction between what the collective West is saying about the long-term future of the counteroffensive and of Ukraine's prospects and the reality on the ground, which is just absolutely brutal.
Yes, and I believe the Russian Ministry of Defense said 60,000 casualties just for the offensive alone, which is a huge number of dead and injured. And even the Western media is admitting that the last of the brigades that were prepared for this offensive are involved in the fighting. They claim that they've gotten through this first line, but I don't even know what they're talking about. What line are they talking about? I think they mean the security zone. But I cannot be sure. And today I was trying to see if there was any news, because if they made the breakthrough, they must be fighting for the next position. But it seems like they're still fighting around these areas they supposedly broke through. Angela, did you get a chance to see this Economist article? There were other articles that came out after this Economist piece, like this one from Newsweek. It says Pentagon chief estimates chances of Ukrainian breakthrough by year end. I don't see that happening. Something that I was looking at was the maps of Russian defenses around Tokmak. And then if you go back to that New York Times article from December, they show layers and layers of defenses even further south between Melitopol and Crimea. So they have defenses everywhere. What makes them think that there's only 2 or 3 defenses at all, and they only need to get through another 1 or 2? Angelo.
Well, Brian, we talked about this the other day. Just think for a second. If Ukrainian forces, they would have crossed just a single line of defense, they would have put so many TikTok videos with the flag of Ukraine dancing around and just partying. We haven't seen anything. Have you seen the defense line? No, we didn't. We didn't, because there was no breakthrough. They're still in a gray area, or they just close by. And I think this is what The Economist is doing here is what we call in French the méthode Coué. Coué was a doctor that actually was teaching his patients that you have to do self-suggestion. The more you repeat lie to yourself, you are going to believe it. So you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, I'm a beauty. And at the end of the day, you believe it. And that is what is happening with Ukraine. I just want to point out, did you see the interview, Claire Daly? She was actually asking Jens Stoltenberg, and she was saying there are 500,000 casualties, Ukrainian casualties, and Jens Stoltenberg, he didn't deny it. He said, well, that's a heavy price, yes, but that's war, something like this. But what I'm saying is that slowly, I think they are going to expose what the reality on the ground, the reality that we've been telling on your channel, and you've been telling also on your own, about the reality on the ground, heavy losses. It's just a butchery, and the problem is that you have 2 different ways of doing the war. One is the war of perception. That's the TikToker videos and just playing on the emotional side. And one is very pragmatic, the long-term game, and that's the Russian side. And again, what is interesting is that if you look at the Russian perspective, they have the Ukrainians where the Russians want them to be. The Russians want to be behind the heavily fortified lines on the defense with artillery superiority, air superiority, and you just let them come. So what happened when it's like this? Well, you have a very high casualty on the Ukrainian side, and that's playing in the hand of the Russian side, because what Russian side wants to do is demilitarization. It's a war of attrition, and sadly, it's about killing Ukrainian soldiers.
Yes, and Danny, I wanted to ask you why do you think the West is compelling Ukraine to do this if it really is just feeding their and you even saw some Western commentators, pro-Ukrainian Western commentators, saying we should stop this now. Even that delusional general who said that they might win by 2025. Even he said, at least stop the offensive now because it's not going to accomplish anything. Why do you think there's this impetus to continue anyway?
I think the United States and its collective West vassals are really backed into a corner here. I mean, you have Joint Chiefs of Staff head Mark Milley also saying similar things throughout the duration of the conflict since November of 2022. Maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to freeze the conflict. You even have Biden saying this at times. But I think being backed into a corner is very difficult for the collective West as a whole. And that it's basically been a combination of these admissions. We've seen it just over and over and over again, admitting that the counteroffensive is stalled, it's slow. Maybe there needs to be a freeze in the conflict because progress is not occurring in the way that the collective West had hoped or wanted it to, or maybe was hoping to wish into existence. You know, there's this term, this almost new age term that younger people use, but really people all across the board in the United States use. They call it manifesting. It's this idea that if you just think hard enough, similar to what Angelo was saying earlier, if you just think it hard enough, if you just want it enough, then you will meet your lifestyle goals or your personal goals, your economic goals. And I think here we see a lot of that going on with the United States, that they are backed into a corner. The entire collective West is in Ukraine, and they can't get out of this corner. They know where this conflict is going. They know it regardless of how long it is prolonged, no matter how long it goes, that Russia has the advantages. It's similar to other wars that the United States has fought in this way. It's you go to another region of the world, you attempt to oppress and to get your way, interfere in affairs. And generally, even if you experience some short-term gains, long-term, people are going to resist. And Russia is just a different kind of adversary. It's a different kind of target. It's just not working out in the way that they had hoped. Really, I believe that with all of the miscalculations, from the economic war to the differences in the actual output that the United States and NATO could put forth in this conflict versus what is actually possible, all these miscalculations are a product of an underestimation of Russia's ability to defend itself and its ability to fight back. And so I think that a big reason for this is that if there is going to be any change in the conflict, the United States needs to ensure that it isn't total Russian victory. So it is just all about prolonging, and it's also about keeping the cycle of war profiteering going, because this conflict is immensely profitable no matter the results of it. As long as it's able to keep going, there's at least that prospect for military contractors to continue to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze more and more federal contracts out of the Biden administration and maybe whoever ends up president in 2024. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that those contracts continue. And so the United States at various points needs to project this positivity, this like false positivity about the conflict, in order to keep it going. But it isn't going to go well regardless. This is going to be the trajectory. I mean, when Russia says it's going to do something, it happens. And we saw this with the Challenger 2 and the Leopard tanks and all these burning tanks on the battlefield. Russia said immediately in January, when these were committed, that they're going to burn in the battlefield. And that's exactly what's happened. Russia has made its aims clear. And while it doesn't project them, or forecast them months into the future, every time Russia says it's going to do something, it happens. With Ukraine, it's always speculation. And this Zaporozhye region breakthrough is another similar point. It's trying to bring some kind of positivity into a completely and utterly pessimistic situation for the collective West prospects.
Yeah, and they admit that they underestimated. Well, some people are admitting that they underestimated Russia, but then they continue to do it. They just create the next narrative where they are completely under. What makes them think that if they underestimated Russia up until this point, they're going to actually make this breakthrough and achieve the goals of the Ukrainian offensive at this point, after exhausting their offensive potential? Now, Danny, you spoke in front of the UN Security Council about this pumping of weapons into Ukraine and how this is not going to bring peace. This is going to obstruct any sort of peace or negotiation in Ukraine. You talked about different weapons and the different kinds of consequences. Well, here are some more weapons going to Ukraine. And this isn't anything new, because depleted uranium rounds went in with the British Challenger 2 tanks. And here is the United States sending depleted uranium rounds with their M1 Abrams. I think a maximum of 30 will be sent. There's only something like 10 that are being prepared right now in total. Eventually, there will be 30. I mean, I already said these are going to end up burning just like everything else on the battlefield. We all said this months and months ago. Russia, like you said, Danny, pointed this out. You go through this article. This is the point I want to make, and then I want to hear everybody's opinion on this. They're trying to downplay the danger of depleted uranium, and they do it in a very sneaky way. They say, depleted uranium really isn't that radioactive, and if you're exposed to it, if you're like sitting next to a DU round, you're not just going to go and get cancer like if you were sitting in a, swimming in a nuclear reactor pool or something. But the thing that makes depleted uranium dangerous is not its radioactive nature. It is also toxic, highly toxic. When you fire a round, it bursts into dust, and people inhale that dust. It enters into the environment. It enters into the water and the food supply, and people are ingesting it, and it is toxic, and that is what's dangerous. And I even have this from the U.S. government's National Institute for Health talking about the toxicity of depleted uranium. So the U.S. is just blatantly lying about this. I wanted to hear your take on this, Danny, and then Angelo, I'd like to also hear what you think about this.
Well, it's disastrous. I mean, Fallujah, 2004, the U.S. raided that city, destroyed that city, used depleted uranium rounds, and now cancer rates in Fallujah up until this day are astronomical. And so the correlation between cancer and other kinds of health issues with depleted uranium are very clear because of these exact effects that you outlined and how they are used and what happens after these rounds are used. But one thing I want to point out here is oftentimes the collective West, what they will do, and especially the mainstream media, you can look at the US mainstream media around this announcement, and you will see over and over and over again, whether it's in the headline or in the content of the articles, what they will presume is that Russia also uses depleted uranium rounds. And what they'll say is that they possess them. And in each and every article you will find, and I know you do a lot of this, Brian, looking into these articles and seeing what they actually say. So when they say that Russia has depleted uranium rounds, they always couch it and follow up with the statement that it is not clear whether these are used in Ukraine. Russia has never verified this. This has not been verified on the battlefield, but yet you've seen over and over and over again, whether it's through headlines and articles, a suggestion that Russia's hypocritical for criticizing the use of depleted uranium. So all of this is meant to try to paint Russia as the villain here, when it is the United States that is going against what is a material, a substance used in warfare that is condemned by over 100 countries in the world, and that actually, no, I'm getting confused with cluster munitions. But depleted uranium has a long history from Iraq to Yugoslavia as being absolutely detrimental to the health and safety of people. And it does have radioactive consequences, but we know that the United States does not care about this. They're using cluster munitions, as I said, which have been condemned by over 100 countries in the world. These munitions still explode in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia to this day. So in effect, this just shows how low the United States is willing to go to prolong this conflict, because it won't change anything. There's nothing about using depleted uranium rounds that will change anything except escalate with Russia and cause devastating environmental consequences, not just to Russians on the battlefield, not just to the Russian army on the battlefield, but it will cause long-term consequences for people in Ukraine and for the Ukrainian forces that are either going to be slaughtered or poisoned by these materials, because this is what happens in warfare. It's not just those who these weapons target that are affected. It is also the very forces that you are deploying to fight these wars. We've seen this in Vietnam, for example, where many U.S. soldiers to this day are not only traumatized by going and invading another country like Vietnam, but they're still feeling the effects of things like Agent Orange, and U.S. soldiers who were deployed to Fallujah feeling the effects of being exposed to that level of toxicity from depleted uranium. So on and on and on. The consequences always backfire. And in this case, given just how high the casualties are for Ukraine, given how low the prospects are for victory, adding another weapon like this into the mix is just meant to provoke and escalate with Russia. It has absolutely no other utility than that. It's not going to change anything. So this really does show the inhumanity of it all. There's no factoring in what could be the consequences, not just for Russian forces, but also for Ukrainian forces and anyone else, all these foreign mercenaries, anyone who's being thrown into the line of contact.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize something you said. It's going to be the civilians in the areas where these weapons are used that are going to suffer the most and the longest, because when the conflict is over, the soldiers are gone, and it's going to be the people living in these areas. And before we get Angelo's take, someone is asking why do militaries use depleted uranium? They're making a tank shell using depleted uranium because it is an incredibly dense metal. And if your tank shell that you're firing at another tank, it's denser than the armor of that tank, it has a more likelihood of passing through the armor. The thing about depleted uranium, though, is that there's so many other ways of doing this. You have all of these different types of armor that tanks are now equipped with. You have RPGs, these rocket-propelled grenades, very simple weapons that can go through almost anything. And so it's an older approach. And the U.S. just has a bunch of these lying around. So they say, just send it to Ukraine. We have them sitting around. Who cares about the civilians? Who cares about the Ukrainians in these tanks when they blow up? And if they manage to survive, they're going to be inhaling all of this DU. The armor is reportedly, well, I don't know if Ukraine's going to get DU armor. There's a top secret armor the M1 Abrams and the Challenger 2 has, and it's rumored that depleted uranium plays a role in that. I don't know if they're going to get any of those. But anyway, Angelo, what do you think about all of this?
I'm actually surprised that the Western media, they're not coming up with a theory that depleted uranium from the US is actually not toxic. I'm actually surprised. I mean, the same as did you see the nuclear waste in Fukushima? All the collective West is closing an eye just because Japan is a vassal state.
Yes.
I just want to point out one thing about where are those depleted uranium ammunitions being used. They're used in Russian population territory. Just think about long term, those wasteland, those land which will be contaminated, will be long term where Russia probably will take back, because those are Russian populated territory. So that is maybe one of the reasons that they're using that. I would be, if it was this in Lvov, fights in Lvov, and the core of those Ukraine Nazis. Land places, I think would be different. They would think twice, because you want to protect the land you're living in. Why would you, just think for a second, why would you use depleted uranium on the land that you are going to be that you cherish? Because ultimately, you know what, I think they do not cherish that land. Ask yourself one question. They are focusing on going towards Crimea, and they're not focusing on taking back the Donbass. Why? Very simple. Because NATO wants Crimea. Crimea is so important for NATO, it would cut the access to warm seas to Russia. If they were caring so much about the Donbass, the other regions, they would go there, right? But they don't care. They actually, that shows us clearly that they are fighting the NATO war. And this is NATO's interest. Crimea is for NATO. It is not for Ukraine. And actually, at the end of the day, we need to keep on repeating, because nobody talks about this. But those lands controlled by Russia that went back to Russia officially and legally, people do not want to be part of Ukraine. And this is why I think I'm not sure if it was Indonesia, but they asked for a referendum control in those lands, meaning, like internationally controlled. I think it wouldn't be a bad thing that we have a referendum, just to show them, well, that is the reality. Because ultimately, why would you want those lands where, 90% of those people don't want to go back to Ukraine? Why would you want to do that when you are advocating self-determination? It's okay for Kosovo, but it's not okay for other places.
That's a very good point. That actually leads us to this. Here's the U.S. State Department complaining about elections being held in the new oblasts of the Russian Federation. And the title is Russia's Sham Elections in Ukraine's Sovereign Territory. And this was September 7, 2023. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken complaining about this. Just think about what the United States is saying. They're the ones who overthrew an elected government in 2014. They installed extremists into power who ran the opposition out of the country, purged them from Ukrainian politics. And from that point onward, all Ukraine had was sham elections. And we're not even getting into the other countries the U.S. invaded, occupied, and then held sham elections in. Danny, where do you want to start with this?
Well, this report comes as the United States literally visits Jake Sullivan. Antony Blinken was just there twisting Ukraine's arm and saying, well, this is where things need to go. And, oh, here's some extra money to keep you loyal, extra arms to keep you loyal. But even before that, around the time of, around the weeks leading into Alexei Reznikov's resignation, Jake Sullivan was there essentially saying, clean up your corruption or, things might get tighter leading into a presidential election coming up. And what did Ukraine do? Well, they tightened up and fired Alexei Reznikov for all of the corruption that has been going on. And corruption that was caused, exactly as you said, Brian, by this coup in Ukraine, which completely destabilized Ukrainian politics, essentially rendered it under the control of the United States and NATO. And what did they do? Well, they created all of these fake institutions to assert its power, to dominate Ukraine, and to use the most corrupt elements from oligarchs like Poroshenko and Kolomoisky. And then you also have, of course, the far right neo-Nazi nationalist elements that they have used not only militarily, but also politically to get their way and to build up an anti-Russia political project, which was always meant to bring conflict to Russia. That is why Ukraine was shelling Donbass all of those years. It wasn't just to get rid of the ethnic Russians and the various forces in the Donbass resisting such a thing, the so-called rebel groups, the People's Republic of Donetsk, etc. It wasn't just getting rid of those forces that were standing up to the shelling, but it was to bring war to Russia's border. And this was always communicated by Russia very clearly that this is a red line. And so the fact that the United States now wants to lecture Russia for taking political steps toward not only securing its sovereignty, but also toward helping the people in the Donbass who in large majorities vote in favor of joining the Russian Federation, which is their sovereign right. It's their right of self-determination. The fact that the United States is lecturing Russia for simply going forward with steps that it probably should have taken in 2014 when the coup happened. And Vladimir Putin himself has said it was regrettable that further action wasn't taken years before. The fact that they're doing it now and they're being lectured and insulted and degraded for this kind of activity is not just hypocritical, but it really does show how the United States has one agenda, and that is using any means of propaganda, of information warfare to undermine what happens all across the world when it comes to steps towards sovereignty. Every time a country takes a step, every time a people takes a step toward true sovereignty, we're hearing now Niger, Russian officials are saying that in Niger, the United States is possibly thinking about, through various intelligence that they've conducted, assassinating Niger's new leadership. And this, of course, as you said, Brian, this wouldn't go against what the United States has done all across the world since 1945 and even before that, which is do anything politically, militarily, and economically to get their way, to dominate other countries and to force countries and people to enact economic and military policies that favor the United States at the expense of these nations, at the expense of their people. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.